Well, hello to my Sunday school friends. It is good to see you. I hope that you are well. I hope that you're doing well in school and that you're healthy and that your family is well. And I am so glad that you are here with me to watch this video. We have been talking about the prophets of Israel, about the prophet Elijah most recently, and he just picked himself up a helper, remember, Elisha. And Elijah and Elisha spent a lot of time pounding on King Ahab because Ahab was a very wicked dude. He didn't do what he was supposed to do. He led the people of Israel astray. But you know, God never writes anyone off. God doesn't say, I'm not going to deal with you anymore. God doesn't give up hoping that we'll be who we're supposed to be, that we'll obey the commandments, that we'll become more and more who God wants us to be. And God hadn't ever written Ahab off either. And so today we have a story in the middle of all those other stories about how Ahab was always in trouble and always did the wrong thing and God was always punishing him, just to remember that God took care of Ahab too. So this is a story about a struggle that Ahab had with the king of Syria, a guy whose name was Ben-Hadad. I'm not sure if that's exactly how it's pronounced, but that's how it's spelled, Ben-Hadad. So Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, wanted to take all of the stuff that belonged to Ahab. He wanted to take his silver and his gold, his property. He even wanted to take his wives and his children, which is very weird, don't you think? And Ben-Hadad really didn't like Ahab and really wanted to do him harm. So he called 32 kings together. In this time, you could be called a king if you just were in charge of a largest city. So some kings were in charge of countries and some kings were in charge of cities. So we have 32 kings, all their soldiers, all their chariots, all their horses, gathered together to go to war against Ahab. And they gathered near the capital city of Samaria, and they were very confident. They were so confident that these kings started to just eat and drink and feast and party, and it was kind of crazy. Now, the prophet of God went to Ahab and said, God sees this great host that's arrayed against you. God sees this big army that's come against you, and God will help you. And Ahab said, how can that be? I only have a few soldiers, and there are so many of them. There's 32 kings over there. The prophet told Ahab what to do, told Ahab that God would be with him. Ahab called his little army together, and they went and they did what God told them to do through the prophet. And by the time they got to the camp, all of those other enemy kings were drunk. The leaders were drunk. They were all had big fat bellies from all the feasting they'd been doing. They were not ready for battle at all. They panicked, and God gave Ahab and the army of Israel a mighty victory. The Syrians and their allies ran away, which was very cool. Well, the prophet came back to Ahab and he said, don't get too comfortable. This Ben-Hadad and his armies are going to attack you again in about a year. And this time Ahab believed the prophet instantly because, you know, everything that the prophet had said had just come true. So Ahab kept his soldiers together, kept them ready, and about a year later, Ben-Hadad and all his allies, they gathered again. This time, instead of being in the hill country near Samaria, they gathered on the plains north of Samaria because they said to themselves, Israel's God must be a God of the hills, but he won't be able to help them on the plains. Which you and I know is crazy. God's the God of everything. God created all things, the hills and the plains and everything else. But Ben-Hadad and the other kings didn't know that, right? And they set themselves up on the plains ready to attack. Again, God gave Ahab and Israel a smashing victory, right? And many of the soldiers of these these invading armies were killed. Ben-Hadad ran away, and some of his leaders ran away with him into a city, and they thought they'd be safe there, but the walls crumbled, and they were exposed. So Ben-Hadad is hiding in this city. Israel's looking for him. And some of Ben-Hadad's servants went to him and they said, listen, king, the kings of Israel, they tend to be merciful. Just dress in sackcloth and go to him and apologize. And some of them went to the king first and they said, you know, we know where Ben-Hadad is and he'd like to apologize to you. He'd like to ask for your forgiveness. And Ahab said that would be fine. So Ben-Hadad came to Ahab wearing sackcloth and apologized to him. And Ahab not only accepted his apology, he let him go. which was not at all what he was supposed to do. God had told the prophet, and the prophet had told Ahab, that letting Ben-Hadad go was not part of God's plan, not part of God's will. But you know, we've heard a lot of stories about Ahab where he doesn't listen really well, haven't we? So he lets Ben-Hadad go. So a few days later, Ahab is out driving around in his chariot, and he sees a guy standing by the side of the road. Very dirty face, very dusty, very beat up, dressed like a soldier. Ahab stops to talk to him, and the soldier says, "I'm glad you're here, King. I have a question for you." The king says, "What is it?" And he says, "Well, during the battle that we just had, I was supposed to take care of a prisoner, and the commanding officer who told me to take care of the prisoner said that if I didn't, I'd lose my life. And I lost the prisoner. What should happen now?" And King Ahab said, "Well, you need to lose your life." And the prophet wiped all the grime off his face. He wasn't a soldier at all. It was the prophet. And the prophet said, "Right back at you, King. You had instructions what you were supposed to do with Ben-Hadad, and you didn't do it. And now you're going to be punished." And Ahab bowed his head. He knew that he'd done the wrong thing. He knew that he was in trouble. And he returned to his palace with a very heavy heart. It's such a good story, isn't it? About God's mercy and about how God keeps giving us other chances. But God really does expect us to obey, to listen, to do what we're supposed to do. And when we do, God blesses us. And when we don't, there has to be discipline. I look forward to talking to you more about Ahab and Elijah and Elisha. We'll see each other next week, right? You take care. Bye-bye.